is a consummate survival actress.
I hope you're having the best birthday you've ever had. Thank you for everything.
Hi, Daddy. I'm English.
Tom Bower, the legendary royal author, is sharpening his quill for a new edition of his book set to reveal huge secrets inside Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's marriage.
There are so many telltale signs that something is clearly wrong with Meghan. And I don't mean it in a bad way, but I mean, how can you get your age so wrong? Did you know that in 1997, when she met Yasmin Bleeth, when she claims that she was working for Humphrey Yogurt, age 13, she also, or somebody with the name Meghan Markle, filled out a questionnaire for Sears, the company, claiming that she was 21 years of age.
But what they need to do is face up to the blackmail that's coming from California and in some way or other undermine Harry's and Meghan's credibility.
She's absolutely ruthless.
This is Meghan's first trip to the snow. Dad took her up to Big Bear.
I think the palace and the machinery of the monarchy needs to take Harry and Meghan more seriously and make sure that Harry and Meghan's antics don't impact the future.
She's stuck because she was an actress who became a real princess, who wants to be an actress again, but has to continue to pretend to be a real princess.
Did you know that in 1997, when she met Yasmin Bleeth, when she claims that she was working for Humphrey Yogurt, age 13, she also, or somebody with the name Meghan Markle, filled out a questionnaire for Sears, the company, claiming that she was 21 years of age.
Something about this story refuses to fade, and it's not just another headline. Because when a seasoned investigator begins questioning details most people never even noticed, it forces a different kind of conversation. And this time, the spotlight isn't on rumors alone. It's on whether the timeline itself has always been exactly what we were told. It begins quietly, almost too quietly to feel important at first, because according to reports, this wasn't a sudden viral rumor exploding out of nowhere, but rather a slow resurfacing of details that had already existed for years, details that were scattered across archives, publications, and digital traces, waiting for someone to connect them in a way that would make people stop and look again. And that is exactly where the name of Tom Bower enters the conversation, because unlike Random,
I thought, what is she not contextually aware of? She's trying to hide something. This is really sloppy.
Professionally, they've gone down dramatically, and I predicted it in the book, but even I would not have thought it'd be that accelerated. I think personally...
Speculation that disappears after a few days, his approach, at least according to those who follow his work, has always been to build narratives through collected material, interviews, and historical records. Which is why this particular discussion is being treated differently by many observers, not because it is proven, but because it is being framed as something more structured than typical online chatter. Now here's where things start to feel a little uncomfortable, because reports suggest that one of the key moments that reignited this entire debate was tied to an old printed feature, something that on the surface might seem harmless, but once revisited, began raising questions that people couldn't easily ignore, and according to the material referenced in a magazine entry from the late 1990s allegedly listed Meghan Markle with an age that didn't align with the widely accepted timeline.
What they need to do is face up to the blackmail that's coming from California and in some way or other undermine Harry's and Meghan's credibility.
Meghan is living a life that she's winning and she's doing all these great things, but the reality is not that. The reality is she's a joke.
This is where the story starts to shift from curiosity to tension, because when a printed record appears to conflict with a public biography, even slightly, it creates a gap, and once that gap exists, people begin trying to fill it. But here's the real question. Does a single inconsistency actually mean something deeper, or is it simply the kind of error that happens more often than people realize? Because that's where the debate becomes layered, and this is exactly what keeps pulling people back into the conversation, because on one side, there are those who argue that printed material, especially from that time period, carries a certain level of credibility, while on the other side, there are just as many voices pointing out that media records, profiles, and early publications are not always precise, especially when dealing with emerging public figures whose information may not have been tightly managed at the time. And just when you think the discussion might settle there, another detail enters.
What the hell is going on with this woman? Is she adopted or is she just a natural? I mean, is she such a liar she can't even understand that we can all see her?
not a surprise here because, yeah, she lies a lot about her stuff. We've caught her in so many lies. Her own sister has come forward, her family, everybody is exposing the lies that she's been telling.
According to reports, there were also claims that at one point, an online industry profile, specifically an IMDb listing, displayed a different birth year than the one most people recognize today. And while some dismiss this as a simple database inconsistency or user-editable error, others see it as part of a broader pattern. And this is where the conversation becomes less about a single piece of evidence and more about accumulation, because one detail can be ignored, two can be debated, but once multiple small inconsistencies begin to align, even loosely, they create a narrative that people feel compelled to explore. But again, we need to pause here for a second, because this is where many discussions go wrong. Because none of these elements on their own confirm anything. They suggest, they question, they provoke, but they do not prove. And that distinction matters more than anything else. So the real tension isn't just in the claims themselves. It's in how they're being interpreted. Because while critics argue that these fragments point toward something being intentionally shaped or adjusted over time, supporters counter that this is exactly how misinformation spreads, by taking unrelated inconsistencies and connecting them into a story that feels convincing without actually being verified. So now we arrive at a deeper layer. Because this is no longer just about dates or records. It's about perception. It's about trust. It's about whether public narratives are always as stable as they appear. And that's where things start to get even more complex, because according to discussions highlighted in, the conversation doesn't stop at early records or digital profiles, it extends into personal accounts, reported recollections, and even interpretations of past timelines, which adds another dimension entirely, because once personal memory enters the equation, the line between fact and interpretation becomes even harder to define. And that raises a question that no one seems able to answer clearly. If multiple perspectives exist, but none of them are fully confirmed, how do you decide what actually holds weight? Because that uncertainty is exactly what keeps this story alive. Not proof, not resolution, but the absence of a clear conclusion. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Because in a world where information moves fast and narratives form even faster, sometimes it's not the facts themselves that drive attention. It's the questions that remain unanswered. So now the focus shifts. Because if early records and digital traces are only part of the picture, then what happens when people start looking deeper into personal timelines, university years, and early career moments? And more importantly, what happens when those details don't line up as cleanly as expected? That's where this story takes a sharper turn. As the conversation moves beyond scattered records and into something far more personal, the focus shifts toward a period that should, in theory, be much easier to verify: education, early adulthood, and the years that shape a person's public identity. But according to discussions referenced in, this is exactly where the story becomes even more layered, because while official timelines appear clean on the surface, some observers have started pointing toward details that feel slightly out of alignment once examined more closely, and that subtle misalignment is enough to keep the conversation alive. Because here's the thing, university timelines are usually straightforward, they follow a predictable structure, and they are supported by records, photographs, and shared experiences, which is why attention has shifted toward Meghan Markle's time at Northwestern University, a period that is often referenced as part of her established background, and on paper, everything seems consistent, with graduation in 2003 and a progression that fits the commonly accepted narrative. But according to some reported interpretations, when people began looking beyond official records and into surrounding details, the picture became slightly less clear. Now, let's pause for a moment and ask something important. Does a timeline have to be perfectly aligned in every detail to be considered accurate, or is it normal for small variations to exist when multiple sources are involved? Because this is exactly where the debate splits. On one side, there are those who argue that once you move beyond official documentation into personal accounts, group photos, and recollections, inconsistencies are inevitable, because memory is not precise and context can shift over time. But on the other side, there are voices suggesting that when multiple small observations begin pointing in a similar direction, even if they are not definitive, they create a pattern that is difficult to ignore. And this is where one specific detail begins to draw attention. According to reports mentioned in, there have been discussions around group photos from that period, particularly social or extracurricular settings where individuals appear together, and in some cases, people identified in those photos were reportedly born several years earlier than the widely accepted timeline would suggest for Meghan, and while that alone proves nothing, because university groups often include people of different ages, it still raises a question that keeps resurfacing. Why does this detail keep being brought up if it doesn't lead anywhere concrete? Because what makes this different is not the evidence itself, but how it is being interpreted. Some observers see it as a coincidence, nothing more than the natural diversity of university social circles, while others believe it contributes to a broader narrative suggesting that the timeline may not be as fixed as it appears. And once again, we find ourselves in that same space between possibility and proof, where interpretation carries as much weight as fact. But just when it feels like the conversation might circle endlessly around interpretation, another layer enters. According to discussions highlighted in, there have also been reported comments from individuals who claim to have been familiar with that period, suggesting that there were assumptions, quiet ones, not public statements, but impressions, about age differences that didn't fully match the official narrative. And this is where things become even more complicated, because personal recollection, especially when anonymous, cannot be verified in the same way as documented records, yet it still influences how people perceive the story. So now the question becomes sharper. Should anonymous recollections be taken seriously when they align with existing speculation, or should they be treated with caution because they cannot be confirmed? Because this is exactly where the story gains momentum. Not from certainty, but from accumulation. And the more pieces are added, even if each one is small, the more the overall narrative begins to feel significant, at least to those already questioning it. But then something else happens. The conversation shifts again, this time toward family perspectives. And this is where the emotional dimension begins to intersect with the factual one, because according to references in, comments attributed to family members have also entered the discussion, particularly regarding how age differences were perceived within the family dynamic, and this adds another layer entirely. Because family memory is not just about dates, it is about lived experience, shared time, and personal interpretation. And that leads to another question. If someone remembers growing up closer in age to a sibling than official records suggest, does that indicate a discrepancy, or simply a difference in how those experiences were perceived? Because memory, especially within families, is rarely precise. It is shaped by emotion, by perspective, and by the passage of time. Yet when those memories appear to challenge widely accepted details, they inevitably become part of the conversation, whether they are accurate or not. And this is where the tension begins to build. Because now the story is no longer confined to documents or profiles. It includes personal accounts, interpretations, and emotional recollections, all of which are harder to verify but easier to discuss. And that combination is powerful, because it keeps the narrative moving. But here's the part that makes this even more interesting. Despite all these layers, records, profiles, recollections, interpretations, there is still no single piece of definitive evidence that resolves the question completely, and that absence of resolution is what keeps drawing attention, because people are not just looking for answers, they are trying to make sense of a story that seems to shift depending on which angle you examine it from. So now we reach a point where the conversation changes again. Because if education, social circles, and personal accounts introduce uncertainty, then what happens when we look at something even more structured? Something tied to career, industry standards, and public-facing timelines. Because unlike memory or interpretation, professional progression follows patterns that are easier to track. And if those patterns don't align perfectly, that's when the story moves into a completely different level of scrutiny. And that's exactly where this is heading next. As the focus shifts away from education and into the professional timeline, the conversation begins to feel sharper, more grounded, and in some ways more difficult to dismiss, because unlike personal memories or scattered records, a career, especially in the entertainment industry, leaves behind a trail of appearances, contracts, casting patterns, and public milestones that are much easier to track over time. And according to the narrative outlined in, this is exactly where some observers believe the timeline becomes even more interesting, not because it clearly proves anything, but because it introduces another layer of interpretation that people keep returning to. Because here's the reality. Hollywood operates on patterns. Casting decisions, career progression, and public positioning are rarely random. They are influenced by age brackets, market expectations, and the perceived stage of an actor's career, which is why attention has increasingly turned toward how Meghan Markle's early career developed, and whether that progression aligns perfectly with the age that has been publicly accepted, or whether there are moments that feel slightly out of sync once examined closely. Now let's pause and ask something that really matters. Does a career path have to follow a predictable timeline to be considered authentic, or is it normal for individual journeys to break those patterns? Because this is exactly where the debate becomes more complex. On one side, there are those who point out that the entertainment industry is unpredictable by nature, where actors can spend years building experience, taking smaller roles, and navigating a highly competitive environment before landing something significant, which means that a slower or unconventional progression does not automatically indicate anything unusual. But on the other side, there are voices suggesting that when you analyze the timing of certain roles, the duration of early struggles, and the eventual breakthrough, it creates questions about whether everything aligns as cleanly as it appears on the surface. And this is where one particular phase starts to draw attention. According to discussions referenced in Meghan's early years in the industry involved a period of smaller roles, auditions, and background appearances, which is entirely normal for many actors. But some critics argue that the length and pattern of that phase, when compared to typical industry trajectories, could suggest a slightly different timeline than what has been widely accepted. And again, this is not presented as proof, but as interpretation, which is why it continues to fuel discussion, rather than resolve it. But here's the real question. Are we looking at a normal career struggle that's being overanalyzed, or is there something about the pattern that genuinely stands out? Because once that question is asked, the conversation naturally moves toward a more visible turning point, the breakthrough moment. Because according to the widely accepted narrative, Meghan's role in Suits in 2011 marked a significant step in her career, positioning her within a recognizable framework that aligns with someone in their early 30s, which is a common trajectory in the industry. But for those questioning the timeline, this is where the scrutiny intensifies, because they begin comparing that milestone with earlier stages of her career, looking for consistency across the entire progression. And this is where things become particularly interesting. Because when people analyze a career retrospectively, they don't just look at one moment, they connect multiple stages, trying to see whether the overall pattern feels coherent. And according to the narrative some observers believe that when those stages are placed side by side, certain elements feel slightly misaligned, not dramatically, not conclusively, but enough to keep the conversation going. But again, we have to step back here. Because interpretation is not evidence. Pattern recognition is not proof. And this is where the line between analysis and assumption becomes incredibly thin. So now the story evolves again. Because it doesn't stay confined to acting roles or career timelines. It moves into something even more structured. Official records. Legal documentation. Because according to discussions highlighted attention has also been drawn to certain changes in how information appears across official documents, particularly in relation to names and recorded details. And while these changes can often be explained by protocol, preference, or administrative updates, they still become part of the broader narrative when people are already questioning consistency. And that leads to another critical question. When official records appear to change or evolve over time, should that be seen as normal administrative behavior, or as something that invites deeper scrutiny? Because this is where the conversation becomes even more sensitive. Because once legal or official documentation enters the discussion, the stakes feel higher, even if no confirmed issue exists, because people naturally associate official records with accuracy and permanence, and any perceived variation, no matter how small, tends to attract attention. But here's the part that makes this even more complex. Despite all these layers, career patterns, industry expectations, official records, there is still no definitive conclusion that settles the debate completely, and that absence of closure is exactly what keeps the narrative alive, because people are not just analyzing information, they are trying to connect it into a story that makes sense. And sometimes, when information is incomplete, the mind fills in the gaps. Not with certainty, but with possibility. And that possibility is powerful, because it transforms isolated details into a narrative that feels bigger than any single piece of evidence. So now we arrive at a turning point in the story. Because if career timelines and official records still leave room for interpretation, then what happens when the discussion moves into something even more personal? Something tied to identity, family, and public image itself. Because that is where the conversation stops being analytical and starts becoming emotional. And once that happens, the story doesn't just continue, it intensifies. As the conversation moves beyond career patterns and into something far more personal, the tone shifts almost immediately, because once identity, family, and public image enter the picture, the discussion stops feeling analytical and starts carrying emotional weight. And according to the narrative referenced This is exactly where the story becomes more intense, not because new facts suddenly appear, but because the focus turns toward how personal details have been presented, interpreted, and sometimes questioned over time, creating a space where perception and reality begin to overlap in ways that are difficult to separate. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Public figures do not just live their lives, they construct narratives around them, sometimes intentionally, sometimes naturally, but always in a way that shapes how they are perceived. And this is where Meghan Markle becomes central to the discussion again, because according to various reports, including those summarized in, there have been ongoing debates about how certain elements of her personal timeline have been communicated to the public, and whether those elements have remained consistent across different contexts. Now let's stop for a second and ask something deeper. Does every public figure present their life story in exactly the same way at all times, or is it normal for details to evolve depending on context, audience, and stage of life? Because this is where the conversation becomes divided again. On one side, there are those who argue that slight variations in personal narratives are completely normal, especially for individuals navigating different environments, from private life to public roles, and from Hollywood to royalty, where expectations and pressures can shape how information is shared. But on the other side, there are voices suggesting that when multiple elements of a personal story appear to shift or change over time, even subtly, it raises questions about consistency, and once those questions are raised, they tend to grow. And this is where one of the most discussed elements enters: family perspective. Because according to references in comments attributed to family members have added another layer to the conversation, particularly when it comes to how timelines and age differences were perceived within the family dynamic. And this is where things become even more complicated, because family accounts are deeply personal, shaped by memory, emotion, and individual experience, which means they can feel convincing while still being difficult to verify. But here's the key question. When a family member recalls events differently from the official narrative, should that be seen as meaningful insight or simply a reflection of personal perception? Because that distinction changes everything. And it's exactly why this part of the story keeps drawing attention. Because people don't just look at facts, they look at relationships. They look at tone. They look at consistency. And when those elements appear to diverge, even slightly, it creates a sense that something might not fully align, even if there is no definitive evidence to confirm that. And just when the conversation seems to settle into that emotional space, another detail emerges: silence. Because according to discussions highlighted in, one of the reasons this narrative continues to grow is not just because of the claims being made, but because of how those claims have, or have not, been addressed publicly. And this is where interpretation becomes even more powerful, because silence can mean many things. It can be strategic, it can be dismissive, it can be protective, or it can simply reflect a decision not to engage with speculation. But here's the question that keeps resurfacing. When a public figure chooses not to respond to specific claims, does that reduce the conversation, or does it actually fuel it further? Because in many cases, it does the opposite of what people expect. It keeps the story alive. Not through confirmation, but through curiosity. And that curiosity is exactly what drives narratives like this forward. Because once people begin looking for answers and don't find them, they don't stop. They dig deeper. They connect more dots. They build interpretations. And over time, those interpretations begin to feel like something more solid than they actually are. And this is where the story reaches a critical turning point. Because it is no longer just about inconsistencies, timelines, or records. It becomes about trust, about credibility, about whether the public version of a story matches the reality behind it. And that is a much bigger question than any single detail. But here's where things take an even sharper turn. Because once the discussion reaches this level, it doesn't stay confined to personal narrative. It begins to touch on something far more sensitive. Something tied to legal interpretation, documentation, and the implications of how information is presented in official contexts. And that is where the stakes feel higher. Not because anything has been proven, but because the possibility itself changes how people perceive the entire situation. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If personal narratives, family perspectives, and public silence all contribute to uncertainty, then what happens when the conversation moves into areas where accuracy is not just expected, but required? Because that is where this story is heading next. And once it gets there, it becomes even harder to ignore. As the conversation reaches its most sensitive phase, the tone shifts again, because once discussions begin to touch on official records, legal interpretation, and the way information is formally documented, the stakes feel very different, not because anything has been proven, but because accuracy in those areas carries a level of expectation that goes beyond public storytelling. And according to the broader narrative outlined in, this is exactly where the discussion becomes more intense, as observers begin asking whether any perceived inconsistencies could extend into areas where details are expected to remain fixed and verifiable. Because here's the critical point. There is a difference between how information is presented publicly and how it exists within official systems, and that difference matters, because while public narratives can evolve, adapt, and shift over time, official records are typically structured, documented, and preserved in ways that are meant to remain consistent, and this is where some commentators begin raising hypothetical questions. Not confirmed claims, but possibilities about how discrepancies, if they existed, might be interpreted within a legal or administrative context. Now let's stop and ask something that cuts to the core of this entire discussion. When people begin speculating about official records without definitive evidence, are they uncovering something meaningful, or are they simply extending a narrative into territory that requires far more caution? Because this is where the conversation becomes extremely delicate. On one side, there are those who argue that examining consistency across different types of records is a reasonable line of inquiry, especially when a public figure's story is under scrutiny. But on the other side, there are just as many voices emphasizing that without verified documentation, such discussions remain hypothetical, and treating them as anything more risks crossing the line from analysis into assumption. And that distinction is everything. Because once speculation begins to involve legal or official implications, even indirectly, it changes how the entire narrative is perceived, shifting it from curiosity into something that feels far more serious, even if the foundation remains uncertain. And this is where another important element enters the story. Reaction. Because according to the discussions referenced in, there have been reports suggesting that responses to these claims, particularly from those representing Meghan Markle, have been firm, with objections raised against how the narrative has been presented, emphasizing that the claims are inaccurate and potentially harmful, and this adds a critical counterbalance to the entire conversation. Because it reminds us that there are always multiple perspectives, not just one dominant narrative. So now the story reaches a point where two opposing forces exist at the same time. On one side, a collection of observations, interpretations, and reported inconsistencies that continue to raise questions. On the other side, a clear rejection of those claims, reinforcing the official version of events and challenging the credibility of the narrative itself. And when those two forces collide, something interesting happens. The story doesn't resolve. It expands. Because instead of moving toward a clear conclusion, it creates a space where people begin choosing sides, interpreting the same information in completely different ways depending on what they already believe, and that is what keeps the discussion alive far longer than a typical controversy. But here's the deeper question. Why does this story continue to hold attention even without definitive proof? Because it taps into something much larger than a single detail. Taps into the idea of trust. Trust in public figures. Trust in narratives. Trust in the information people are given and the way it is presented. And once that trust is questioned, even slightly, it becomes difficult to restore it completely, because people begin looking at everything through a different lens, not just this story, but others as well. And that is where the real impact lies. Not in whether any single claim is true or false, but in how the conversation itself changes perception. Because once perception shifts, it influences how future information is received, how stories are interpreted, and how credibility is evaluated. And that effect does not disappear quickly. It lingers. But here's where the story leaves us. Because despite everything, every claim, every counterclaim, every piece of discussion, there is still no definitive conclusion that settles the question once and for all, and that absence of closure is exactly what keeps people engaged, because unanswered questions are far more powerful than confirmed answers when it comes to attention and curiosity. So now it comes down to you. After everything that's been discussed, do you think this is a meaningful pattern that deserves deeper scrutiny, or simply a collection of coincidences that have been amplified into something bigger than they really are? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I want to know where you stand on this. And if you enjoy deep, high-retention breakdowns like this that go beyond surface-level headlines, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned, because the next story might raise even more questions than this one.